Hey guys, welcome back to Andy's Dinosaur Reviews. Today we are going to take a look at another Kid Galaxy set, and this set actually has a ton of dinosaur figures included, and you can see them once we start here at the bottom rung. We can move up, and there are many figures in here in this set, so it's a much larger set than any of the others I've reviewed in the past. Very interesting looking species included within. There's actually another box set like this that I'm consistently on the hunt for that has an Tyrannosaurus in it. It looks really good, but I can't ever seem to actually get a hold of that set. But I do have this larger set, which does include some very interesting species. So let's go ahead and turn the box around. We'll take a look at which species are actually included in this set. So starting up here at the top, we clearly have a Gigolotesaurus, which we've actually reviewed that figure here in the past. We have a Carnotaurus, which we reviewed a very similar figure of. We have the Diceratops, which we have also reviewed. We have the Euoplocephalus, which is new to my channel, and Amargasaurus, which is also new, and I actually think the rest of these are all new that I have not reviewed previously. A Suchomimus, a Brachiosaurus, an Allosaurus, a Triceratops, and a Diceratops, which is very interesting. Such a very obscure species, which I don't even believe is actually called a Diceratops anymore. Now I believe it's a Netoceratops. So interesting that they would choose that species, but there are quite a few included in here, so let's go ahead and break this box open and get our dinosaurs out here to look at. Okay, so after what felt like years of battling with that box, we now have our dinosaurs out and about, and there is the Giganotosaurus. Here is our Suchomimus. Then we have our Amargasaurus. We also have our Allosaurus, which he doesn't want to stand very well. We have our Carnotaurus, along with our Diceratops, then a Brachiosaurus, and the largest here so far, the Euoplocephalus, a Triceratops, and a Styracosaurus, which is also a very large figure. So quite a few figures here to look at, a whole bunch included with this set. I do believe the number would be 10 dinosaurs altogether. So let's go ahead without any further ado and take a closer look at each of these very cool looking Kid Galaxy figures. So here is the Giganotosaurus, and we have actually reviewed this guy previously on the channel, so I don't feel like there is any need to look at the figure again. It was actually the exact same figure that we reviewed last time here. I believe it was like a 3 or a 4 pack from Kid Galaxy that included this figure. So this guy we can skip over. We can also skip over this Styracosaurus, because again I have reviewed the Styracosaurus here on the channel, and if you would like to see the reviews of either of these two guys, I will include links in the description to where you can check those out on the previous reviews that I filmed here on the channel. So these two figures we can put to the side. But then we're going to start with my favorite dinosaur species of all time, the Carnotaurus. Now we have actually reviewed a figure like this previously, except it was the larger articulated version. It wasn't this smaller, non-articulated version, which now is like a much more solid type of a material. Previously, it was hollow. But just like the last Carnotaurus, it's not exactly what you would expect to see on a Carnotaurus. It's very inaccurate in almost every possible way, including things like the head sculpt just being entirely wrong, and then we've got way too long of arms, and the body shape itself just doesn't really appear to look too Carnotaurus-like. But if we go outside the box here and we think about this as like maybe some kind of very cool crazy hybrid or some sort of species of dinosaur that we may not have discovered quite yet that may have been related to a Carnotaurus or looked similar to a Carnotaurus, it looks like a decent figure, honestly. It does include some very nice sculpt and detail all throughout the figure, I will say that, and the paint job is actually quite nicely done, except in the mouth area there is definitely some tremendous amounts of sloppy paint up here in the mouth area. The teeth are an absolute disaster. You can see that that is just horrendously bad as far as the paintwork goes. Quite possibly one of, if not the worst painted mouths of a dinosaur figure that I have ever seen, but the body paint itself actually looks quite nice. It's got a very realistic appearance to it. It's applied quite beautifully. They didn't include any paint really on the nails. They just kind of ran like a dark paint over the feet and the hands to kind of insinuate that, but I think it still looks okay for what it is. You do have some nice eye paint with a brown color and a black pupil, and it's glossed quite nicely, but up close you can definitely see how inaccurate this Carnotaurus, in quotation marks, figure is in pretty much every possible way. But again, as far as the actual skin texture and the detailing of the figure, it is not that bad and definitely sports some pretty nice sculpt work, some pretty decent sculpt work. We're not going to go over each of these figures as thoroughly as we would normally do, just because there are so many. We have 8 figures to get through here, but honestly, I don't think this figure here is that bad as far as the sculpt and detail goes, but you can take accuracy and throw that out the window. Then we have the Amargasaurus. And the Amargasaurus looks interesting. It's something. It doesn't really look even remotely accurate. You're not really ever going to find too much as far as accuracy going on in a Kid Galaxy Dinosaur set, but this figure itself looks kind of cool just because it at least has some vegetation here in the mouth, so it's a little different than what you see often with dinosaur figures, and I do actually like the fact that there is some vegetation included in there. But once we leave that very cool aspect of the vegetation, you can see that as far as an Amargasaurus goes, it is very, very inaccurate, but the detailing of the body as well isn't really that great. You can see that it's almost like a 1980s dinosaur toy style detailing where they just kind of put a lot of creases throughout the skin and there's no real skin texture or anything. It looks okay as far as the paintwork goes. I think they did a good job, fairly well anyway, as far as the color choices that they picked for the Amargasaurus. And in some areas it almost looks like it's got some decently done detail. It's just not really that great. It's more like the lazy way, I think you could say, of sculpting out skin detail by just kind of giving it lots and lots of creases in the skin, but at the same time it doesn't look terrible. I mean, it's interesting. We do have a tail here on the ground, so maybe this is their take of the vintage style Amargasaurus, which you don't see done very often. But otherwise, I think the figure is interesting. We'll put it that way. Very, very interesting. I did not realize his nostrils are awkwardly up here on the top of his head, almost to the back of his head. His nostrils are behind his eyes and everything. Super, super weird looking. Actually, now that I see that, he's really quite hilarious looking. I don't know what they were thinking with this guy, but he is definitely the class clown. I will give him that. Then we have our Diceratops, which first of all, I don't have any idea what's going on with his horns up here on his head. I don't know why they're facing backwards. I think if they would have faced them forwards, it would have been a pretty cool looking figure and wouldn't have looked quite so inaccurate. But, I mean, it still wouldn't have been perfectly accurate, but it would have looked a little better. But regardless, the horns, if we get away from the fact that the horns are totally in the wrong position, I think the detailing of the figure looks quite nice. It's got some pretty decent sculpt work. The paint application looks okay. It's nothing flashy, but it's not really that bad either. They do have a nice gloss coat for the beak of the Nedoceratops. I'll call it that because Diceratops is not even actually the species name anymore. But you can see that the actual detailing of the figure is half decent. It's not terrible by any means. It's not like a highly detailed figure like you would see from most companies like Collectae or Safari Ltd, but it's also not as bad as far as some of the other figures included in this set are. I think it looks decent, very inaccurate just like every figure so far, but once again sports some fairly nice skin texture, some fairly nice minute detailing on the figure, and at least is a very cool, interesting species that you don't see get made figures very often. In fact, I don't think I actually have any figures of the species, so it's pretty cool to add one into my collection, even if it is fairly ugly and incorrect as far as the placement of the horns. It's actually, before I even take him away, I almost took him away without saying, but it's actually really, really small. You can see it in my hand. It's the smallest figure. I think this one would be a competition between this one and the Suchomimus, so they're both really tiny figures. But since we've got our Suchomimus here to look at, we might as well take a look at him now. You can see that the head of the Suchomimus looks kind of silly. He looks a little goofy, but at the same time, it at least almost resembles a Suchomimus and the way it would look somewhat. I am actually quite excited to see that they even have kind of like that little hooked jaw right there, which is something that is associated with this species of dinosaur. And you can see running down the body, it's got some okay sculpt, but I think this is another one that kind of has like generic sculpt work, because you can see that it's just kind of been given like this one pattern as far as the skin texture goes, and that's kind of the entire outlook of the dinosaur as far as the skin texture, except on the underside. Actually on here it says it's a Baryonyx, so the box is telling me that this is a Suchomimus, but the underside here of the dinosaur tells me it is a Baryonyx, and even as a Baryonyx it is also quite inaccurate. But I think that the company itself should have at least figured out what species it was that they were including and not just create random dinosaur figures and then give them whatever name you feel like giving them, because that seems to be the case as to what Kid Galaxy does from time to time. I'm not a huge fan of the paint scheme. I don't really like my dinosaurs being purple. I don't think Barney was a Suchomimus or a Baryonyx or whatever this is supposed to be. So I'm not a huge fan of the actual color scheme here on the figure, but I will say that the paint application applied does look fairly decent as far as the application of it. It doesn't look like paint on a figure or anything. It does look like body color. The eyes also are painted quite nicely and have been given a nice gloss. You have the teeth in there, which those as well are a little sloppily painted, but the teeth on the upper jaw look decent. It's the teeth on the lower jaw that look pretty bad. And you also have a tongue, but the tongue is only half painted for some reason. However, it is actually quite nicely sculpted. If you can get in there to see it, it does include a little bit of decent detail. So, another interesting figure, but not really very good either. And then we have a Brachiosaurus, which the face of the Brachiosaurus immediately makes me believe that he just stubbed his toe, because he looks like he is in horrible pain right now. But the detailing of the Brachiosaurus in the face up here, again, the detailing looks decent, not really that great, but it looks okay. As we run down the neck, you can see the skin detail actually start to pick up, and you can really take note to some decent skin texture throughout the Brachiosaurus at least, although he looks super awkward. Like, his neck is just very strange looking. It looks like it just gets really, like, it's kind of thick here, and then it gets super thin right here, and then bulks up a little bit as it gets up to the head, so it looks extremely, extremely weird. Almost like maybe he's choking and he's contracting his neck here in the center and trying to dislodge whatever it is exactly that he's choking on. Again, the tail is down here closer to the ground, and for some reason with this Brachiosaurus, it looks super awkward, like he's kind of like hunched over. It almost makes him look like he's very depressed. It's like the Eeyore of Brachiosaurus figures. But again, he looks decent as far as the skin texture goes. I will give Kid Galaxy credit where credit is due. They actually did a decent job as far as the skin texture and the overall detailing of this figure here specifically. Not so much some of the others, but this one looks okay as far as the skin texture looks. But the entire sculpt is incredibly awkward looking. Doesn't really look too Brachiosaurus-like. Definitely not accurate Brachiosaurus-like, I will say that. The neck looks extremely, extremely weird. The tail being so low to the ground looks weird. The hunch in the back looks weird. And the face specifically looks extremely strange. So another interesting figure, but by no means a good figure. The paint application on this one actually looks a little more like paint on a figure, more so than skin color, so that is another downside for this one, but I actually kind of like the idea that they went with. As far as the overall design of the paint scheme, it looks okay and very interesting. Color choices chosen, not bad at all. It's just the figure as a whole is quite weird. Then we have our Allosaurus, which, interestingly enough, I recently reviewed an Allosaurus from Kid Galaxy, which had a very similar paint scheme to this, but not quite, and it actually was a decent looking figure, sported some really nice detail, but one thing it was kind of missing was this trademark Allosaurus crest. But now this smaller version does pick up where that one left off and include a crest. Maybe not your most accurate Allosaurus crest, but it is in fact there. And the paint job, although it looks similar, is slightly different because I don't believe the previous Allosaurus had like this greenish tint to the upper side of the dinosaur. But as far as the Allosaurus paint scheme goes, this is 2 for 2 as far as me liking the paint scheme. I think this one is another really cool choice as far as the paint apps used for it, and it's really applied quite nicely in person. It definitely does look very good on the figure. The figure itself, however, is very strange looking. Again, super awkward. The mouth just looks really, really weird, and the sculpt, again, is not very accurate. As far as an Allosaurus goes, you just don't see an Allosaurus looking like this in real life. But one thing on this figure that is a little bit more improved than the last one is the fact that the tail is longer as well. So we have a more accurate length of the tail, but an overall very inaccurate Allosaurus. But you can see some decent paint application again included, and the sculpt also actually has some fairly decent detail included as well. If you took this again as like a totally unknown to science species of dinosaur we haven't discovered quite yet, it could be a decent figure because it does include some fun sculpt and detail. It's a nice solid figure. It's fairly high quality the way it feels. So it's got some redeeming factors, but as far as being an Allosaurus, It's very underwhelming, I will say that. It's not very good as far as an Allosaurus goes, but as far as just a random, really weird dinosaur figure, it's pretty fun. The teeth are a little bit nicer painted on this than the last few figures, but also still really quite sloppy. You have a green eye on this one, as opposed to a brown eye, which seems to be something that was a reoccurring trend on the figures. We're usually having brown eyes, but this one's got a green eye, so it's nice to see them switch that up a little bit, but otherwise I'm not a huge fan of the figure's sculpt, but I do like the paint. Then we have a Triceratops, and I don't know for sure, but the Triceratops looks very similar to the Jurassic Park 3 Triceratops in certain aspects, except for the frill just looks like a woman that woke up having a really bad hair day. I'm not really sure what is going on with the frill, why it looks so incredibly wide. It looks super, super strange. But if you look at it from the side, now it kind of looks like the JP3 Triceratops from Hasbro, and actually does appear to have a pretty decent looking sculpt to it. I really do quite like a lot of the detail on it is nicely done, and the paintwork as well is quite nicely done. There is a lot of skin texture to be found, really beautiful skin folds, kind of the movement of the dinosaur shown throughout. The sculpt also looks quite nice, lots of osteoderms all over the Triceratops, so this one definitely has some really nice, really redeeming factors to it, as opposed to some of the others, with much nicer skin detail, much nicer skin texture, as well as a nice paint job for the most part. The tail is, once again, almost dragging on the ground. If I actually stood it up, it might be on the ground. So for some reason, they're really enjoying more of like the old school vintage look as far as the tails dragging on the ground with quite a few of these figures, and I don't know why. But this one is probably one of the better figures of the set as far as the Triceratops goes. If it weren't for that odd-looking frill, I think it would have probably been the best figure included in this set, although I really don't know which one I would classify as the best figure, but this one would definitely be a contender for it. It does sport some nice, decent sculpt work, some nice paint work, and overall is a fairly nice-looking Triceratops, aside from the frill. And the final figure of this set is the Euoplocephalus, which I actually really did want to get a hold of this figure for a while now, but now actually seeing it in person, it was not worth the wait at all, because it's very, very underwhelming once again, super weird looking. It almost looks like he's like a gladiator and has like a gold helmet or something on up here. He looks very strange. That paint scheme, or that paint application, I should say, I'm not a big fan of. It looks very unrealistic on the figure. It doesn't look like a color that you would expect to find on a species like this, because it's very glossy, very shiny, and just does not look real on the figure at all. If you look at the figure, though, it does sport some decent detailing, but it is once again extremely inaccurate. You could see in general just how thin the dinosaur is. That is not even remotely the type of an appearance that you would see looking above a Euoplocephalus. It really looks super strange. The armored area up here also doesn't look correct. In general, the dinosaur overall is extremely, extremely inaccurate, but as far as the detailing goes, it sports some nice-ish detailing. It's a little muted as far as the actual skin texture goes, because you don't really see any kind of like scaling or anything in like the stomach region, but I think the legs look fairly decent as far as the detailing goes. And then coming back here into the tail, you can see kind of like once we reach this point, the detail starts to pick up a little bit and looks fairly decent. You've got a very nice club tail, which once again makes him look kind of like he'd be like some kind of crazy golden gladiator. But I think the detailing of the figure, for the most part, looks good in certain spots and not so good in other spots. You've got like some osteoderms here and there on the figure. You've got some screw holes on the figure over here, some very Hasbro-like screw holes. So immediately we are forced with a huge downside as far as that goes. But this figure is like kind of okay as far as some of the detailing goes, but the inaccuracy of the figure is almost something that I can't even stand to look at. It's so weird looking. I do like the walking pose that they've gone with, though. That is quite nice, but overall, another very strange figure for a very strange Kid Galaxy set. So, there are two figures that do include articulation, just like the box said. We have the Euoplocephalus, which has articulation in the neck, and then in all four legs, as well actually as the tail. So we have some decent articulation on the Euoplocephalus. And even though we've reviewed him before, the other one would be the Styracosaurus, which does also include neck articulation, leg articulation, and tail articulation, which now that I moved it, it was a little stiff there. You can see that. So the articulation is exactly the same for both of these herbivores, these articulated herbivores, but every one of the other dinosaur figures that are included are skimped out here as far as the articulation goes, which I'm actually okay with because the articulated dinosaurs that are included are a hollow plastic, so they're not really as well made as some of these other figures are. But again, for the most part, almost every figure in the collection is a pretty bad figure, so I'm not really too worried about articulation or how well they're made, because overall, it's not a very redeeming set, that's for sure. As far as the size goes, I'm not going to measure each and every figure, there are just too many, so I will hold the tape measure over top to hopefully give you somewhat of an idea of what the size of the figures are, but otherwise we will do a size comparison. And there is Mr. Papo T-Rex, the Attack Pack Allosaurus, and Robert Muldoon mixed in here with all of these very strange Kid Galaxy dinosaur figures. This is almost like a traveling circus of dinosaur figures with kind of the weird sideshow version. Not sideshow from Dinosauria's sideshow either. I mean sideshow like it's quite a big gang of freaks. But you can see them next to the Papo Rex and Mattel figures, just what the size are. Some are really small, some are medium, and some are kind of approaching larger, but it's a pretty decent mixture of all three size groups. So this Kid Galaxy set is very, very interesting. It definitely includes some of the ugliest dinosaur figures that I've ever seen, specifically that Amargasaurus. I almost want to light on fire, but a lot of the figures are just fairly hideous overall, and in my opinion, definitely not worth a purchase. And you don't hear me say that too often because I'm really a big fan of anything dinosaur normally. There are some decent figures in here, but I actually ended up having to pay around $30 for this set, very close. But luckily, I actually got refunded because I had initially ordered the set with the Ouranosaurus in it, and there's an Ouranosaurus and a Kentrosaurus in that set that do actually look really quite nice, and that was the entire reason that I purchased the set. And in my hunt to always find wonderful Ouranosaurus figures, I really did think that the $30 price tag was decent enough to purchase that set, because otherwise it's like $65 most places that I see it. Unfortunately, they sent this set instead, which when I complained to the seller and asked if I could exchange it to get the correct set, they just refunded me and told me to keep this one. And I can definitely say that without question, I would not have picked this set up for $30. Initially, there's just no way. Looking at the figures here, it's kind of like when you first see this set, you look at it and you're like, oh wow, look at all these cool dinosaur figures. It's kind of flashy, makes me want to pull out my wallet and pick it up, but actually looking at the figures out of box, hopefully I've shown you just how hideous this set overall truly is. There are some fun figures in here, like I kind of like the Allosaurus figure, even though he's incredibly inaccurate like every single figure in here is, but I actually like the paint job on him quite a bit, and he does sport some fairly fun detailing. The Gigolotesaurus as well is a fairly decent looking figure, not exactly accurate either, but still fun. It does sport some pretty nice detailing overall, and a paint scheme that's quite nice, very similar to many pictures of a Giganotosaurus that I've seen in illustrations in books. But I think the Triceratops as well is fairly decent. It's got some nice detailing and some nice paint application, just a little bit of an awkward look as far as the frill goes. But then you have the Suchomimus / Baryonyx, which is just really quite bad. You also have the Carnotaurus, which is also really quite bad. He's got a fun paint scheme, I will say. I really do like his paint scheme a lot, but the actual sculpt of the Carnotaurus is definitely not that good. Then you have the Styracosaurus, which is decent-ish at times, but it's also not a very good figure. But again, if you want to see more on that one, you can check out my other previous review. You have the Brachiosaurus, which is one of the most awkward-looking figures, and if it weren't for that Amargasaurus, I would say the Brachiosaurus is definitely the weirdest-looking figure. But the Amargasaurus clearly takes the cake in that aspect, as he is just one of the goofiest-looking dinosaur figures I may have ever seen. And then we have the Euoplocephalus, which looks decent from the side. When you first look at it from the side, you think, oh, that could be a pretty fun figure. But once you actually get it up close, and then especially getting up above it and seeing how horribly inaccurate the figure is overall, it definitely drops many, many points as far as how appealing the figure truly is. So there are quite a few different decent looking paint applications on the figures, but overall I think the figures, as far as the sculpts go, are really, really bad for the most part, and every single figure in here, again, is quite far from what the actual species looked like, so I definitely do not recommend picking this set up, but if you would like to pick this set up, I will do my best to try to find a link to include, because I always want to give you guys the option, even if they are really bad figures, of potentially picking them up if you are interested. If I can't find a link, I do apologize, and hopefully you guys can acquire it somewhere if you do want to, because these sets, these larger sets specifically, are fairly hard to find at times from the Kid Galaxy line. So again, check the description. I may have a link, and if not, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next review. Thanks for watching.